Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a video all about the end of my Napoleon project. So essentially I just really wanted to have a very casual video where I kind of wrapped up my yearly reading goals, and all of my yearly reading goals for 2021 were encompassed by one project where I was trying to read about Napoleon. I'll link to my original video about that down below, but essentially I just themed the year of 2021 around Napoleon as a historical figure because it was the bicentennial of his death. And I had also been reading a really excellent biography of him that revealed that Napoleon was a very bookish person. And so I read classics that Napoleon read, I read nonfiction about Napoleon. It was just a really fun way to structure the reading year and kind of have a theme for the year that encompassed everything that I really wanted to read more of in 2021, nonfiction classics, translated fiction, historical fiction. It was just a really great way to make sure that all of my goals kind of had a through line and were really connected together, which I think made them easier to achieve. I apologize for this big blank space behind me now that Christmas is over. I've got nothing. I really don't even know what to put here. So I moved my K-pop albums here. I only have 4, and so they seem like really small and puny, and the colors of them are not my vibe. They're not my aesthetic, so I'm not quite sure where they are gonna wind up. But I did get a poster in one of them that I wanted to put here, but it was of a single member, and that faces the door, and I genuinely thought that would scare the living daylights out of me coming down the hall at night. So I am in the phase where I'm trying to figure out what I want to do in this space, because throughout the fall and throughout the Christmas season, I had a lot of stuff sitting right here that I think really made this a very enjoyable space, in my opinion, but maybe it'll just be a place to stack up more books. But I basically wanted to talk a little bit about my favorite book that I read for the project, my least favorite book that I read for the project, what I learned throughout this, whether this is something that I would do in the future, and things that I didn't get to that I was really excited about. Let's get the bad out of the way to begin with. My least favorite thing that I read for this project was Voltaire's Candide. And I knew I would probably not like this. This is a classic that I have never really wanted to pick up. And there have been a lot of reasons for that. I don't think that I tend to really enjoy satire. It has to be done in a very particular way for me to feel as though I really enjoyed it. This one was one of the ones that I did not really like, that I did not really enjoy. I read this in a themed reading vlog where I read 3 classics that Napoleon recommended. Interestingly enough, this is not actually a classic that Napoleon truly liked or truly recommended. I have a lot of lists of Napoleon's library of books that Napoleon read throughout the biography that I read, which I'll talk about here in a minute. There were constant references to books that he read and that he really, really enjoyed. Voltaire is an author that he had a very convoluted relationship with, and so I also feel as though I have a very complicated relationship with Voltaire. This is the one that I think Napoleon did not really care for either. He was really more interested in Voltaire's poetry, I believe, and his nonfiction writing than he was in this. And I think that I might agree with him. I think on the whole, throughout the year, something I will go on and say is that I do think Napoleon and I have quite a bit in common in terms of books that we've really enjoyed. And so I was really excited to take recommendations from him, and learning what his real opinion was on Candide was very validating for me, because it was a book that I really struggled with and that I just genuinely did not think was funny. And there were parts of it too that I understand I likely did not get. So this is one that was just completely not for me, and apparently it also was not for Napoleon. I'm encouraged by the fact that Napoleon really enjoyed other things by Voltaire, and prior to learning about how Napoleon felt about Voltaire, I really didn't know what else he wrote. I didn't know that he really got into nonfiction or that he tried to write epic poetry. That's really exciting to me. So I do think I would really like to try more from Voltaire, but I really don't think that Candide is going to be a work that I ever revisit. When thinking about my favorite book that I read for the project, it actually has to be the book that inspired me to make 2021 a year of reading about Napoleon, and that is Napoleon the Great by Andrew Roberts. This is such a phenomenal biography. I picked this up late in 2020 basically because I felt as though I knew nothing about Napoleon. I felt as though that was a blind spot that I have in terms of history that I really wanted to fill in. I've always been skeptical about it though, and I've not really wanted to get really into Napoleon because my perspective of him is as a military man. And I am genuinely very little interested in military history. We go back far enough, I can get into it, but Napoleon's more kind of semi-modern warfare is not something that really interests me, and I'm not really interested in strategy. I understand it, and I respect it, and I respect people who are, strategists and who are essentially military geniuses like Napoleon was. It's just not something I enjoy learning about. And I really had a preconceived notion of Napoleon prior to reading about him, but that's all he was. Almost immediately, this biography completely changed my mind about Napoleon by proving to me that Napoleon as a person is far more interesting than Napoleon as the general or Napoleon as emperor. This is the only biography of Napoleon I have ever read, and thus I don't really feel as though I can speak to the quality of it. I don't really think I can tell you that this is easily the best biography of Napoleon out there because I haven't read any others. And so I wonder if my attachment to it is because this is just where I first learned about Napoleon. This is where I first got all of my information, but I do really think this was skillfully done because there was always an emphasis on who Napoleon was as a person rather than as a figure, which was really fascinating and I think is what made me kind of fall in love with Napoleon a little bit. Andrew Roberts did a really interesting thing where he completely disarmed you when you started this biography. In the first chapter, all of your illusions about Napoleon were broken down, and he exposed you to Napoleon as a boy and Napoleon as a young military soldier, which was really endearing. Napoleon as a romantic, Napoleon as a reader, which was really, really, like I said, endearing. And you came to really like him as a person before he started to do really complicated, convoluted military maneuvers that you're really not sure how you feel about. Throughout my year of reading Napoleon, I've gotten to speak with quite a few European readers about Napoleon and about changing opinions of Napoleon as a person, which has been one of the most interesting aspects of the project to me, to go off on this side tangent, because I've specifically spoken to a lot of French readers who talk about the dual nature of Napoleon in France, that Napoleon is talked about as a great man, but he is also really, really criticized. And thus, there are many people that kind of straddle a line with him and aren't quite sure how they feel about him, and they respect what he did for France's legacy, while at the same time really not liking him as a person, which I think is really interesting and is of course true of a lot of really big historical figures, especially from this time period. It kind of reminds me of a lot of Americans' relationship with our founding fathers, acknowledging the great things they did while at the same time acknowledging the really horrible things they did, which is the way I think it should be. But I also heard quite a bit from other European readers who were not French, who still feel kind of the scars of what Napoleon was doing during the Napoleonic Wars, which was genuinely fascinating to me because I also heard quite a bit from Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian readers, and their relationship with Napoleon is far more contentious and is almost wholly negative with very, very little positive in it, because that is how they have been exposed to Napoleon through school and certainly living in a place that he came through and essentially massacred in a lot of different ways. And so it's interesting to see the perspectives of Napoleon, because I walked into this thinking I too would hate him and I really would find him arrogant and over the top, and he is arrogant and over the top, but there's something so charming about it once you have learned about Napoleon as an individual, which I think is what was really fascinating to me and is why this book became my favorite of the project. This was the one that inspired me to make 2021 about Napoleon, and it's still the best book that I read for it because Napoleon as an individual is far more interesting than any of the classics or other nonfiction works that I read. I would much rather have spent time with him as a person than reading any of his favorite books, which is an interesting thing to say, and not exactly how I really thought the year would go, especially when I do feel as though he had very similar reading tastes to me. But this book really exposes you to the side of Napoleon that was well read, that was bookish, and that was very nerdy and romantic. And I still love thinking about all of the letters that he wrote Josephine, that Josephine was like, I just don't have time for this. She thought he was a complete sap. And he kind of was, but that's not really what you would think of Napoleon as being. And that he carried, you know, the flame for her throughout his life. On his deathbed, his last words were about her. He also apparently wore a violet on St. Helena and Elba for her because that was her favorite flower. Like every day he put a violet in his lapel for her. And it's just interesting to really see the nuance of a person. I think this biography made Napoleon so human to me that the military achievements seemed fake. He seemed so real and so personable, as if he would just walk off the page and shake your hand. And it was just so disarming because I think I went into this expecting, you know, a man's man, just a masculine war leader that I would probably not get on with. And yet there are so many different layers to who Napoleon was as a person, and he kept those. It's not as if when he became a military leader, he lost that softness. He was hard-edged, but inside he was still a really soft, romantic guy, which I think was so fascinating and is probably, again, why this book became my favorite of the project. This book never once lets you forget who Napoleon was personally, and I think that's what made it a great biography. It wasn't just about the things he achieved. It was about the things that he failed at. It was about the things that he wanted in life that he didn't get, and it was about him personally, hobbies that he had, things that he liked doing, which I think made this such a human biography and a really wonderful reading experience. Sometimes you finish a book and it feels like you've lost a friend because the door is closed now. I walked out of this biography with a new friend for life. I feel like Napoleon and I do get along in terms of reading. He is a very complicated individual, and my feelings with him have ebbed and flowed over the year because I have, on the one hand, really enjoyed him as a person, on the other hand, really objected to a lot of the things that he did, but that's the dual nature of history. A lot of people believe there can't be nuance in historical discussion, but there absolutely should be. It's not black and white. Somebody is not good or evil. Napoleon is a really great example of that. And so I just thought this was a really smartly done biography. It is one of my favorite biographies I've ever read. And on the whole, I am really glad that it inspired me to make 2021 the year of reading about Napoleon. Going kind of hand in hand with the biography, I read more than a few reflections on Napoleon from his time that were in poetry. I didn't read any nonfiction that was written really close to his lifetime, unfortunately, which I really wish I had. And looking forward, that is something that I would really like to do because I think that would probably be a very interesting aspect of scholarship on him. But I read quite a few poems that meditated on Napoleon's death and also Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. That was some of my favorite reading of the year, actually, was reading specifically the Romantic poets and their reflections on Napoleon as a person and their very complicated relationship with him. Specifically, I want to talk about Lord Byron because Lord Byron, I think, had a very up and down relationship with Napoleon, where he at one time really respected him and really admired him. He was a hero to Lord Byron at one point, and then after Waterloo, you know, there's a lot of disappointment there for Lord Byron. He wrote a really great poem about the defeat at Waterloo and how if Napoleon had been worth anything, he would have gone out in a blaze of glory. He would have died in the battle rather than going into exile. Lord Byron looks at that as a major humiliation for Napoleon. And in many ways, maybe it was. But this was written between the gap of Waterloo and the 100 Days, which I think makes it a really interesting snapshot into a very specific period in time. We, looking back, know the 100 Days are coming. Everyone else thinks Napoleon's done for, and this is over with now. And I was constantly wondering throughout the year if Napoleon ever had the opportunity to read the Romantic poets, as I feel like he really would have loved them because he loved Goethe. Reading some poems that were written about him, I wonder if he should have, because some of them were quite negative, but this was a really interesting one, and I have a video all about it that I'll link to down below where I read this poem, and it's just so fascinating. I think Lord Byron is just a really interesting poet, and it was really interesting too that Napoleon was such a bookish person, and to be commented on by another great of the age, it just really shows you how peppered this time in history was with really great historical figures. But something that I just thought was really cool was how Napoleon certainly really appreciated literature and poetry, and to be commented on by one of the greats of the era is just really interesting. And I wonder if he knew anything about it. I'm not sure, because I certainly feel like the fact that Napoleon was very well read was part of how he built this image around himself. I think Napoleon had an understanding of how things went for the ancient generals. Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great in particular were two of his favorite historical figures, and he really wanted to be the heir to them. And I think he knew how history viewed them and how contemporary sources viewed them, because he was so well read, because he read so much, so deeply, and in so many different languages, that I think he knew how he wanted to craft his image, which is so interesting. I just think there's a lot about Napoleon that's fascinating, but I think that really shows here in commentary on him by other bookish and well-read individuals, because Byron makes a lot of classical allusions and compares Napoleon to men who fell, men who were great once but fell into obscurity when hardship came. And it makes you wonder, had Napoleon never come back for the 100 Days, would we have viewed him alongside the men that Byron mentions? Is it the 100 Days that cemented Napoleon as great? I personally think a whole lot happened before the 100 Days. It's still worth discussing, but it's interesting to see a snapshot of that time period. But this is one that was one of my favorite experiences of the year. I really enjoyed reading poetry that had to do with Napoleon. On my big list of books that I wanted to read for this project that I mentioned in my initial video, there were a few things that I did not get to that I'm really disappointed by. One thing that I really thought I would read and that I'm kind of shocked I didn't get to, but on the other hand, I kind of felt like that was coming, is Stendhal was on my list. His essays about Napoleonic Europe in particular were on my list, as was the Charterhouse of Parma. And I didn't read a single thing by Stendhal this year. It didn't really feel like a year to try to understand Stendhal. I have a fear about him, I think, as an author, and I think I'm not gonna like him. I guess that's my fear. I feel like on paper, everything about him is something that appeals to me and is something that should really work well for me as a reader. But I have the sense that I am not going to like him. I think that's because a lot of people have one favorite by him, but don't tend to like anything else that he did. And so I'm curious to know which one that will be for me, if that will really be the Charterhouse of Parma, if it will really be the Red and the Black, or will I really like his essays? I'm not sure. But this in particular are his reflections on Italy post-Napoleon, which is a really, really interesting time period for Italy, and is also really interesting in how it was discussed at the time, because Napoleon went into Italy and basically took all of their art and took it home. And he set up shop there in a lot of different ways. Northern Italy was part of his empire at one time. And so there is a really contentious relationship between Italy at this time with Napoleon, and actually now, according to some Italian readers who've spoken to me about Napoleon, which has been really interesting. It's so funny how something that happened 200 years ago is actually very, very current for the places where it occurred. And absolutely that's true even here in the United States. I live in the South. You see the scars of the Civil War all the time. And that was 150 years ago. So I certainly understand that what Napoleon did is very, very fresh in a lot of places, especially when you think about the art that he took from Italy much of it is still in the Louvre. Much of it never went home, sad to say. So Napoleon's relationship with art was another really interesting thing that I got into this year. And I wish that I had gotten to read Stendhal's reflections on it, but I'm not shocked that I didn't pick him up this year. Stendhal is also apparently a great fan of art, and he fainted, I think, when he saw the David one time, which is now called the Stendhal syndrome or something like that. Someone told me about that. It's when you start getting faint when you see a really great piece of art. And I thought, oh wow, finally there's something to call that when your heart beats a little faster, when you feel like you might faint. It actually is something that apparently occurs, that people will pass out when they see the David or when they see the Birth of Venus. It happens quite a bit in Florence apparently, and I can see why. So on a personal level, I feel like I would like Stendhal, so maybe this is one that I should try and get to this year in 2022. Maybe I'll try to read everything by him. I think maybe that might be the best way to do it, is just to really dive in with Stendhal. Something else that was on my list that's one of Napoleon's favorites of all time, so I feel pretty confident about me liking it, because we really did get on in terms of most of the classics that he enjoyed. But that's the complete essays by Michel de Montaigne. So Napoleon loved Michel de Montaigne. He was a Renaissance thinker of the 1500s, and he essentially invented the essay. And he wrote a lot of different reflections on many different aspects of life and literature, history, which I think would be really fascinating reading. And until the end of his life, Napoleon kept a copy of Montaigne's essays with him. And there is a list of what was in his private library at the time of his death that was then auctioned off. That's online somewhere. Montaigne, he had multiple editions of Montaigne, and that's really why you don't know sometimes whether or not Napoleon really liked something, because even if he didn't like it, he tended to keep a copy in his library if he thought it was important. So some things I'm not sure if he even really liked, but I really enjoyed a lot of what was on his shelf. So I feel sure that I would probably really enjoy this. I started reading the introduction, as you might can see. I never intended to fully read this because, as you can see, it is over 1,000 pages, and I think it would be really, really interesting to take this piecemeal, to read one essay at a time, and I do believe when I get into this, that's what I'm going to do. But Montaigne is one big Renaissance thinker that I have yet to try, and I'm really shocked that I've not yet read him. So I'm really excited to get into him. And again, I think I'm just gonna move this over into 2022. Last but not least, the big blind spot for me with this project was historical fiction. I actually did not read any historical fiction throughout the year that had anything to do with Napoleon, which is a massive disappointment to me, and is actually not something that figured very greatly in my initial plans for the year. I don't think I had anything in particular in mind in terms of historical fiction, but about halfway through the year, I picked up Sandra Gullin's Josephine B trilogy, which has come highly recommended to me by several other booktubers, and I really intended to read this. I really did, but I now wonder whether it's the right place to start with Napoleon historical fiction. I say this largely because I don't like Josephine. One thing I will say about Napoleon the Great, the biography by Andrew Roberts, I will say that he doesn't really give Josephine a good rap. Josephine comes off very, very poorly in that biography, and clearly that's affected my relationship with her. But historical fiction is, I think, the biggest blind spot in the year. I didn't read a single bit of historical fiction that had anything to do with Napoleon, which is a big disappointment to me. This is one that I would really like to get to because I've heard it's absolutely fantastic, but I would love to hear down below if you have any Napoleonic historical fiction recommendations. I also have not read the Sharp series by Bernard Cornwell. Bernard Cornwell wrote my favorite historical fiction series of all time, and so I do feel as though I should give that a shot, but there are so many books in it that I'm not quite sure what I want to do there, and I don't think it really has much to do with Napoleon as a person. Maybe it does. Maybe I would find that out if I got started on that series. But historical fiction is definitely something that I really wish I had gotten to this year. So that was my Napoleon project. Do I consider it a success? I personally do. In the second half of the year, I probably didn't read a single thing for it, which is a-okay by me. That's often how it goes with yearly reading goals for me. And I've said it so many times before that I think most of y'all know this about me by now. Goals are not things that I really take all that seriously, and I'm not disappointed with myself when I don't achieve goals because I tend to realize that there's a reason why I didn't do that, and it's probably that about halfway through the year, I was no longer interested in reading those books. This year, I just had a very weird reading year in the second half of the year. And actually, my excitement and my enjoyment of my Napoleon project is something that I feel I sustained throughout the year, actually. So it is something that still really keeps me pumped, and I really, in the end, don't want to close the door on it. I don't want to say that 2022 is going to be another year of Napoleon because this is the bicentennial of Percy Shelley's death. And in general, I wanted to make the year more about Percy Shelley. But I do feel as though I can't close the door on Napoleon. I feel like Napoleon still has a hold on me. And just talking about the books that were on my list that I didn't get to, I'm really, really excited about those reads. And so maybe this is me saying that the Napoleon project is still ongoing. I think it really is. In the end, this was a really fun idea. It is something I am so glad I did. I enjoyed making sure that everything that I read in a year was themed around a particular person. That was so much fun to me because throughout the year, I do feel as though I got to read a lot of great books, which of course is the goal of most reading goals. But I also feel as though I got to know Napoleon as a person. And there are a lot of historical figures that of course I love and that feel very, very current and alive to me, though they may have been dead for centuries. Napoleon is one of the few I would say now feels like a friend. I feel as though I have a very deep understanding of his reading taste. I feel like he and I would probably get on when we were talking about books, though he had quite a poor opinion of women, so we probably really wouldn't get on all that well. But I do think I walked out of this project with a deeper understanding of him as a historical figure, which was also ultimately my goal. My goal was to read a lot of interesting books, but it was also to get to know Napoleon, and I feel as though I achieved that. Napoleon was a person I knew very little about going into 2021, and I've exited 2021 knowing a lot, not only about what he achieved, but feeling as though I know him personally, which is a real gift, I think, with historical figures. Sometimes we get so caught up in dates, names, what battles were going on, their political achievements. When Napoleon was crowned emperor, for example, we get hung up on things like that, and we lose sight of the fact these are people just like you and me that lived 200-300 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and they were just put in extraordinary situations. Now, Napoleon is probably a more extraordinary person than I am, you know, on a basic level, because he did have the ambition to want to do these things, and he also had, you know, the arrogance and the power-hungry nature of it. And there's a lot of really negative qualities to Napoleon, but there's also something about him that's deeply relatable as a bookworm. And so I just really enjoyed this project. I don't want to close the door on it. I want to continue to read more about Napoleon, but that is my 2021 yearly reading goal summed up, and I do feel as though it was a success. I would love to know if you've read any books about Napoleon down below and if you recommend any of them. But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.